to FL Talks. I'm Peter Isaacson, Fair Observer's Chief Strategy Officer. Today, I'm joined by retired General A.K. Singh, a top-rank commander of India's tank forces with unparalleled experience in military hardware and strategy. He was also Lieutenant Governor of 2 provinces and now serves in various contexts as a strategic analyst. His 40-year military career led him to collaborate at different times with Soviet, NATO, and even post-Soviet Russian commands, offering him a wide perspective on the military dramas of our day, and particularly the 2.5-year-old war of attrition in Ukraine. So, A.K. Singh, welcome to Fair Observer.
Thank you, Peter. What a pleasure to be with you, a man of your strategic standing. I concur that we are at a very critical stage in this conflict. But as my opening statement, let me give an overview before we focus on the present issues. So, Peter, in my view, this is a conflict that should not have been. The root issues have been known to both sides since end of Cold War. But international centers of compellence have forced the conflict. US neocons and a subservient EU/NATO on one side, Russia on the other. Ukraine is just the means caught and is being devastated. Western mass media has been driving the narrative so far, and social media giants have been forced to take sides. The issue of morality and HR violations is a central theme, but the duplicity is stark. How is a Ukrainian life more precious than a life in Palestine, Afghanistan, Syria, or Libya? The global south, may I say, is not party to the conflict, and bulk of the world's population is more balanced in their view of this conflict. Geoeconomics has emerged as important as geopolitics, and sanctions as a potent tool, but are double-edged. If you have a resilient economy, and as Atul of Fair Observer says, a fortress economy like Russia's, then you can be resilient. There are lessons for India, especially with reference to self-reliance in key defense technologies and manufacturing. From an Indian perspective, we have many suitors, not a bad position to be in, and thus far we have played our cards pragmatically. Both the Prime Minister and Foreign Minister have kept Indian interests to the fore. So here I am, Atul, to give you whatever you throw at me to answer that. All yours, sir.
All right. Well, I totally agree with you about how this war we've been talking about for 2.5 years could have been avoided. I think a lot of people have gone over this. I know, and I totally agree with you, that the media in the West has refused to discuss it in terms of the actual history. So what's interesting now is that some of the things that people were saying and seem to be concerned about are becoming clearer today. The war has reached a critical stage. We're now waiting on this particular day to understand whether the Western coalition of NATO, the US and UK in particular, will decide to use long-range weapons, to authorize the use of long-range Western weapons against Russia. I'll ask you this first question as a military man. Is this a significant step if it takes place, if it's authorized? And if it is significant, how significant would it be?
Well, I would say it's a critical juncture. And so far, while many countries in Europe have been clamoring for this, the Americans have been rather cautious
Yeah.
because they are aware of what Russia is a holder of the largest nuclear stockpile. Their nuclear doctrine is quite clear that if you threaten Russia, then they will use all means at their disposal. Slowly, if I may say, with great apprehension, slowly we are creeping towards an actual red line. Till now, the red lines were not that significant. And I think at least Russia has been quite restrained in its response to those crossing of those red lines. But if long range missiles, long range bombs start raining on Moscow in the garb of saying that you are attacking their military targets, then I think Russia will be with its back to the wall, and there will be great pressure on the hierarchy in Russia to take significant steps to neutralize this. And we all know what those steps are. So, from a personal assessment point of view, I am still hopeful that better sense will prevail, and the delusion in which some of us are living, we will take a step back from that. We are creeping towards a very serious situation.
Yes, that's certainly the impression everyone gets. And it's very difficult to talk about it today, this particular day, because we don't know what decision is
Right.
finally going to be announced. And then we won't know what the follow-up would be, whether that is actually translated into action. The other question I have in my mind, I don't know if you can answer it, but I'd love to have your opinion on it, is that everything that happens today in the US and obviously has a direct bearing on everything that's concerned with Biden's commitment to this war, is linked to the outcome of the election in November. To what extent the actions today that people are taking, the decisions they're making, and then the actions they'll take in the next 2 months are influenced by the election? I have a personal opinion or a feeling that maybe everything is designed to prolong the war until November, and then to look possibly for a solution, because you may know that the Wall Street Journal reported that they're now talking about winding up the war, that everyone has recognized that Ukraine cannot win the war. So where does that leave us? We've got an election coming, we've got decisions being made today, we have actions that will be planned at least for the next 2 months. Is there any kind of perspective that makes any sense to you?
I think, Peter, I agree with you, because that event, the election in the United States, has an overbearing influence on what is happening and what is likely to happen, including this decision that is taken today. Pragmatically, logically, they should not take a decision to authorize the use of Western equipment to hit Russia deep inside. But if in their assessment, this is going to give a leg up to the present administration and their party, then they may take a controlled step. I personally feel that pragmatism will still and caution will still play its part. And as I read, even the powers that be in United States are divided. I'm told the MOD, Ministry of Defense, and the Pentagon are against such a decision, whereas the State Department and the intelligence agencies are pushing it. In fact, I'm quite surprised that the head of one of your premier intelligence agencies, Mr. Burns, he understands Russia very well, and he has written in the past about Russian red lines. And now we are talking of a catastrophic series of events. I hope with just 2, 3 months left for the elections, a pragmatic approach would be adopted by America. Europe really will fall in line with whatever America decides. And Zelensky is not a player in such decisions. He may shout at the top of his voice, but to everyone, at least in the South, global South, he appears delusional. For example, you talk of the Kursk invasion, you talk of the F-16s coming to Ukraine. They are not going to make a difference to the outcome of this conflict. The bottom line is, Peter, in my assessment, everybody understands it, that Russia cannot be defeated. The point is, how much of its objectives will it achieve? And will the war come to an end before it does that? There is ambiguity about what its final end state and objectives are at the moment. Certainly, capture of the Donbass and ensuring that in any negotiation, there is foolproof guarantee that NATO will not expand into Ukraine. I think these are two critical issues.
Yes. Now, you say that everyone understands that Ukraine cannot defeat Russia. And even that's an interesting question. What does it mean to defeat Russia? Does it mean simply to push Russia back to where it was? Or does it mean to undermine the current system and the current regime and to achieve some kind of regime change, which seemed to have been the objective of the US? They didn't want to admit it outright, but it came out in a lot of different discourses. My question is this: you say that everyone understands it, but the Western press is still saying victory is possible. In the debate the other night, the journalist who was interviewing the two candidates tried to press Trump on the idea that you must be committed to winning the war. And just this week, Tony Blinken actually said, we're out to win the war. So there's a bit of a contradiction in what we see and what you said, which I totally agree with, that anyone who's observing this closely knows that it's impossible for Ukraine to win. So where does that leave us psychologically? And again, this has an impact on the election, but this is a very complex situation in terms of the way that the media will talk about it and the way officials will talk about it.
I agree with you. I am not a specialist on Russia, but I spent a year in Russia in their tank academy at the height of the Cold. And then I've been associated with their equipment and I've visited Russia. I understand their psyche very well. And one thing which everybody got wrong was that there will be angst against the hierarchy, Mr. Putin, for example. But all this war has done is to get the people to line up behind him. Please go back to World War II. Stalin had committed such horrendous atrocities on the Russian population. But once the German blitzkrieg reached the gates of Leningrad and Moscow, the people forgot that and fell in line to defend their motherland. So I think whatever delusions the West may be looking at, I think they need to be more realistic. PSYOPs is one thing. Well, you can say something to get an advantage using PSYOPs. But I think hard-nosed discussions and deliberations need to be done. And more important, Peter, I feel that the kind of criticality that is developing today, there needs to be at least backdoor channels that should be working, talking to each other, especially Russia and America. The rest don't matter. And this war, let me also state, everybody should realize that like most conflicts, this conflict will also end up on a negotiating table. And the solutions will be found there. There is jockeying for favorable positions. I understand that. But in the bargain, we should not create a critical situation.
There again, I have to agree with you and then ask a further question, because it's obvious that any conflict is going to end with some kind of negotiation. But the impression that's being established, I would say, not just given, but established with Washington, is that diplomacy is surrender. It's appeasement. You don't negotiate anything. You just push until you get some kind of military outcome, really, which I find very strange, because all the wars that in my lifetime since Vietnam have just ended with no negotiations. I mean, there were phases of negotiations in Vietnam, but the war itself was prolonged until it just somebody lost it, or the U.S. gave up doing what it had promised to do for 20 years. So what's the situation now? Because negotiations itself has been given bad press, and that came out, as I said, in the question that was asked to Trump. You don't negotiate, you win a war. You don't end a war. And Trump made the very reasonable statement that I want this war to end, and I will do things that are required to do it, which is the perfectly reasonable, normal, rational thing to say. But he was criticized for it because he was not committed to the American side. So how do you see what really intrigues me is that you talk about negotiations and you talked about US and Russia. Well, who is actually going to negotiate? Is it the US? Is it Putin and Biden, or Putin and somebody else, whether it's Trump or Harris, who's going to sit down and say, okay, let's work this out? Or is it Zelensky, who is no longer president, by the way, and people may not be aware of this, but his term ended in May of this year. How can you imagine, how can you envisage a negotiation in the coming months or year?
Peter, a few key issues. One is that there used to be some basic trust between the two superpowers, US and Russia. That trust seems to have vanished, if not completely, to a large extent over the last 2-3 decades, ever since NATO started creeping eastwards. And I think presently the first thing that needs to be established is a little more trust. After the Minsk Accords were broken, not progressed, and the statement of Angela Merkel that we went for those accords only to buy time. So Russia will be cautious. Russia will be rather cautious. And it is quite clear that Mr. Zelensky is not a legal president anymore, and he will fall in line with what US decides, as he did during the Istanbul talks. So I feel that what stage we will move from this conflict to negotiation is hard to predict at the moment. But I think the next few months are going to be critical for Ukraine because of its limited capacity to continue to fight this war. They are suffering on all counts, and a stage may come if their defense collapses, then I don't know how we will proceed further.
Okay, so how do you read the Kursk invasion in the light of what you've just been describing? Because obviously Ukraine is weakened. Everyone seems, we use everyone in quotes because everyone who's not officially in the speaking to the media from the State Department is saying that Ukraine is in a very critical situation now. The Kursk invasion took place a month ago. It's still, they're still there. How is that evolving? How might that evolve? And was it a mistake or was it a breakthrough?
First, there is no clarity as to who was the backbone planner of this invasion. Was it the West or was it solely confined to Ukraine? I refuse to believe that Ukraine could do such an act, such a risky venture without backing from the West. They have committed their crack troops, their strategic reserves into this offensive, and they had gained some initial surprises. So presently, the situation is that while tactically they have made some gains, taken PWs, captured 1,000 square kilometers, they are holding 25, 30 settlements, but operationally and strategically, this has put them in a very difficult situation. As I understand, there is no coherent defense line which they can hold. And the Russians, their main objective, of course, they achieved an initial objective of raising morale, of taking to the offensive. But their main objective of diluting the Russian offensive in Donbass did not work. Because as I understand the Russians, they don't look at tactics. They focus on operations and operational art and strategy. And that dictated to them that Kursk is something they can let it be and deal in their own time. It's just 0.007% of Russia. And they know that sooner than later, the Ukrainians will be driven out, as per Russian sources. And I'm talking, the best inputs that you are getting today is from bloggers, on both sides. I think that's quite remarkable. And as per them, I think the Ukrainians, who probably committed 7, 8 brigades, 15, 20,000 troops, the Russians are claiming to have neutralized over 10,000, over 100 tanks and other various kinds of equipment. And today, as I understand, the Ukrainians are holding small defensive positions, widely separated. There is no coherent defense line because if they get together, they'll get decimated by the firepower that the Russians enjoy. The Russians have so far only brought in troops from outside, and their focus seems to be to use both direct and indirect fire, more of indirect fire, both air and ground, to decimate the Ukrainians. Simultaneously, they are also cutting off their logistic lifeline. And sooner and later, Ukraine will find it difficult to replenish and sustain the forces that they have. In my view, as a military observer, I would say they have made a mistake, which is often committed by people who don't think it through. That means they did not clearly see what is the end state in the Kursk invasion and what will happen after a month when they have, now the Russians have started responding. So as I see, the Ukrainians have 3 options. One is to dig in where they are, and sooner than later, they will lose their logistic supply line and they will slowly be decimated. Second is to withdraw to a shallower kind of bridgehead which they can hold. And third is to slowly save whatever troops they can because of the denuding of troops from Donbass, opposite Donbass, has greatly weakened them there. And that's where they need to hold. If Pokrovsk falls, which is the critical logistic hub, I don't know what is their next defense line till they reach the Dnieper River. So the ball is in the court of the West and the Ukrainians, and they need to figure out what to do. This invasion has certainly not given them any operational or strategic advantage. And today, most analysts in the West, including some media, are beginning to recognize and reiterate this fact.
Yes, the other day, where about a week ago, the Financial Times organized an extraordinary meeting between the head of MI6 and the head of the CIA, William Burns. And what struck me is that they were both asked to justify the Kursk invasion, and they put the best face on it that they could by saying that it was, I can't remember exactly how they said it, but they said it gave a boost to morale. And in fact, it's something in what Moore said that struck me. He said, to some degree, in the way he formulated, and I thought that gives the whole game away. He doesn't believe it.
Yes, Peter, he came out much more direct and cognizant of what is happening.
Yeah.
I think the head of MI6 was more pragmatic in his assessment of this.
More pragmatic than William Burns, is that what you're saying?
Absolutely.
Yeah.
Because Mr. Burns is a very senior and experienced man. I think was following a particular line which they wanted to, probably to boost the morale of the Ukrainians and to convince them that don't give up, we are there for you. One of the things which the Americans have succeeded so far in is to give that reassurance to Ukraine that they are there. Unfortunately, while that reassurance may be true, Ukraine continues to suffer. In my view, Peter, every nation, the hierarchy of every nation has his first responsibility is to protect the interests of its own country. And you can see in this whole gamut, Americans, they are let's say, trying to denude the Russians with very least cost to themselves. That's why this war is continuing. If there was a cost like in Afghanistan, Vietnam, Iraq, this war would have ended. So at the moment, it is something the Americans can live with. Russia is absolutely cognizant of the critical nature of what is happening and how it impacts the strategic interests of Russia. I have so far failed to understand how the hierarchy in Ukraine is trying to protect the interests of its own people. 500,000 dead, millions have left the country. The country is devastated. And look at what you are fighting for. You are fighting for Donbass, where majority of people want to be with Russia. It's not as though they have come. So I think it's kind of strange. And sometimes you feel bad for what the Ukrainian people are going through.
Yes, they're the forgotten members of this drama, because we're so focused on who's going to win and who wants to win and so on. One of the things I mentioned earlier is that the US has seemed at some point very early in the conflict to be focused not on defending Ukraine's sovereignty or territoriality. They seem to be focused on the idea that there could be regime change in Russia. Have they given up on that, do you think? Or is that still a hope?
The ground situation and whatever one is picking up from both the West and from the Russian, I read some Russian media to get an idea. I think support for Mr. Putin is quite strong. And there are no centers left there who can challenge him. There was hope that there could be some kind of resistance within but that's not happening. And I think presently, unless there is a catastrophic event, this is something that you cannot pin your hopes on. It's like a country in South America hoping to have regime change in United States. It's not possible to do that.
So my question is, I agree, I totally agree with that. My question is, do Americans refuse to recognize that? I mean, when I say Americans, we don't know who we're talking about. Are we talking about the White House, or as you mentioned earlier, the Defense Department may have a different position? Are we talking about the political class? Are we talking about Wall Street? Are we talking about the average American who actually knows very little and is totally ignorant about all these things? But the question is, and I say this as an American who grew up in the Cold War, is that we're always, whenever there's a conflict, we're led to believe that there's some kind of objective that can be achieved. In the case of Vietnam, it was to prevent communism from taking over an entire country, and presumably to impose a Western regime. But that would have been possible. You could say that the Vietnamese regime of Ho Chi Minh was not a solid political entity that could have been challenged, and the West could have realized its vision. And at some point, it's true that the Americans realized that wasn't possible. They'd gone in the wrong direction, and they hung on as long as they could, even after the Paris negotiations, to prolong the war until they just happened to give up. Are we seeing the same? Will we see the same kind of thing in Ukraine? Because there was this belief, and that it's still maintained, as we can see amongst certain officials and in the media, that we can weaken Russia, we can change the landscape of Eastern Europe and get Russia out of the picture as a political player. What you're saying and what I see, and admit so many other observers say, that's impossible. That's not going to happen. At what point does that make sense for Americans, and what point does that change their policy? Is it just, are they just going to hang on as long as possible and pull out, or will they make some kind of decision and say it's time to solve this problem?
You know, I follow both the media and the alternate media in the United States. And there are growing voices, some very credible voices who understand clearly what is happening. And they are actually saying that two things. One, that the administration and Wall Street is not being fair to the American people. They are not putting up the facts as they should. And so there is a media blitz that is trying to capture the minds. But the alternate media is picking up, and there are sharp remarks on the alternate media. And I think if you look at it, anything is possible. Firstly, the strategic aim that they set for themselves, I would say, knowing what Russia is, a fortress economy, has everything. The economic sanctions haven't worked. In fact, the life of the common man is far better than what it was before. Secondly, look at how the Americans or the United States has turned volte-face. You take Afghanistan. Who could have imagined that they would strike a deal with the Taliban and withdraw in humiliation? Same in Vietnam, same in Iraq. So I think there is a feeling that this war is not hurting America like the previous wars have. And therefore, in the long run, if they can start diminishing Russia to whatever extent, it is, let's say, favorable for their geopolitical assessments and such like things. But I feel that strategically there hasn't been a debate. What has happened today in the last 30 years since the end of the Cold War? I think the West could have come to a reasonable agreement with Russia. And with what they have done, they have kept poking this bear and have driven it almost into the Chinese arms. So today, strategically, I think the situation could have been better if it was handled in the right way. And I hope the elections, once they get over, I am sure there will be a pragmatic review. But there is also a feeling that the strong lobby of the military industrial complex in America is benefiting the most. In fact, they seem to be the only ones who are benefiting. And therefore, they don't want this thing to stop. And so long as American lives are not at stake, and it's the Ukrainians who are being cannon fodder, then I think we could even see this war rolling into the next year. I don't know.
Yes, what you say, I find really intriguing. That I don't know if that's what you were implying, that the Americans didn't realize that the war would actually help Russia and improve the economic conditions of the average Russian. And that what surprises me in that is when I grew up learning history in the United States, it was my teachers told me very clearly that Franklin Roosevelt did wonderful things to stabilize a country that was in total disarray after the crash of 1929. But he didn't manage to get the country going in any serious way. It actually took off, and the US became an economic power thanks to its involvement in the Second World War and the military economy. And then 20 years later, what do we see? We see a president like Dwight Eisenhower, who leaves office warning people that this machine that had permitted the growth of the American economy and the creation of what people call the Pax Americana was now in danger of taking over the whole culture of the country, the whole political culture. Americans should have. We all knew that giving a country the opportunity to build itself militarily and be effective in that operation is the best recipe for comforting its economy rather than destroying it.
Right.
So what astonishes me is that what you're describing, and I can see this, is that Americans have not realized that they didn't manage to take that fact from history and transpose it to the situation of Russia. And what they've done is, and of course, John Mearsheimer said this 10 years ago,
Yes.
that he couldn't understand how the NATO policy of expansion into Ukraine in 2014-15 was made any sense because it was pushing Russia into the arms of China and doing exactly what Nixon didn't want to do and did and tried rather successfully to avoid, and that is having the two communist parties, the two communist countries, powerful communist countries, potentially powerful, working together. Keep them apart, and America can rule the world.
A strange thing, Peter, is that sometimes you are left to wonder, is anybody held accountable in America for whatever is done? Right. So you've taken positions which have gone, for example, you take Afghanistan. I think you take Iraq. The whole offensive was built on, let's say, not very truthful grounds. And nobody was brought to the book. Is it because it's the administration of the day that has a worldview which the common American man is not interested? He is interested in different things which affect his life. And he just leaves it to the administration of the day to pursue what they want. The architect of this whole business in Ukraine at the lower level, of course, was Victoria Nuland. She's left now. She's teaching in some university.
Colombia.
Yes. So the point is that US is a very, very powerful country. There is no doubt in that. And they are powerful in ways which others can't imagine. But I feel that a change of tack is required in the way they see in the way they view the world. Today, the world is moving away from Pax Americana. I think there are voices. You take the case of India. I think India is very friendly to America. The common people of India, their dream always was to get to America. But India has not taken a blind position. Our hierarchy, the Prime Minister, our Foreign Minister, have taken a very pragmatic position, which is in India's interest. And like both of them said, when Mr. Zelensky told them that you are being neutral, they said, no, we are being neutral because we want peace. We are not here to prolong the war. This war should end. And that's what my opening statement was.
That's what Modi said to Putin the first time they met after the beginning of the war.
And India has very discreetly offered its services in whatever manner, along with a group of other countries, to help the two sides get together and solve this issue. It is, if you were to ask me, who's benefiting from this? The only people who seem to be benefiting is the American military industrial complex, as President Eisenhower said. And I think it's in the interest of the world. There are a whole lot of collateral issues that are arising because of this conflict. And I think we now need to see a seriousness in approaching this conflict. It's just come out that the Istanbul Accord was initialed, and then it was at the instance of America that Mr. Johnson went there and got it back.
Victoria Nuland who admitted that.
She's admitted it recently. And that's why I said, is there any accountability at all, or you can do what you like? And that's how it is.
I think that's the real drama of American democracy, is that it's built in such a way that, given the economic system, the capitalist economic system, it's built in such a way that powerful economic interests who are invisible in politics, they don't appear, they fund campaigns and so on, but nobody sees what they're doing and how they're making decisions and how they're supporting policies. They get in the position of being able to determine the policies that are being made. How do you define accountability? Because it's a politician who's going to, it's the Congress itself that's going to legislate, then it's executives who will validate and implement a policy. There's no way the voters, who have the only power they have is to say, I'll vote for this party or that party or this person. They have no way of understanding what the link is between how a decision was made and the person who made it.
Right.
That's why the person who made it can always say, well, I had no other choice, and that's the way it looked at the time, so we did it that way. So now vote for me because I will do something else. That means there's no continuity. And this is what I was saying about history itself. We know about the history. We know how history works. Not in all cases, but there are patterns that are discernible. And if you don't reflect and say, if you do this in such a circumstance, if you create a conflict which obliges a country to invest in its military, you're actually helping that country rather than weakening it. So this is for me a very deep-seated problem in American political culture is exactly what you're saying, that it's built in such a way that there cannot be accountability. There's no way you can say somebody made this happen and had a reason for making it happen and must account for whatever comes out of that.
Peter, I don't know if you are aware that I am one of the very few officers who has trained in the Soviet Union at the Tank Academy for a year, and then with NATO and did my staff college in UK, Cambridge, at the height of Cold War. So one has a fairly good interest and knowledge about both sides, and more about the military leaders, giant military leaders in World War II and thereafter. But today, when I look from here, the present crop of leadership falls slightly low as far as speaking truth to power is concerned. I'm surprised that while strategists, academics in America have spoken somewhere close to reality, haven't found too many people in uniform, those who have retired, speaking truth to power. And I think it's part of this whole military industrial complex which engulfs everyone. And so they all follow one particular line.
Okay, your remarks earlier about how the global South reacts to everything that's going on and how it's taken its view is very different, is totally opposed to the view that's been created by Western media, raises another question for me in terms of what's going on today. Next month, there will be the BRICS summit in BRICS represents well, it represents some kind of force, which is not easy to define. How do you see the possible influence of BRICS on what's going on today and the resolution of not only this problem, the problem of Ukraine, we've got the Middle East as well. Is there anything that's likely to happen soon? We can see it happening slowly, but is there anything likely to happen soon? And what is the role of BRICS?
Peter, I think people in the South are beginning to realize that they don't want to be caught up in the superpower conflicts that have been waged. And while America still holds the pride of place as far as power and influence is concerned, slowly there are voices that are rising as to how American exceptionalism, how American strategy has affected our lives, and the alternate mode and alternate view that is emerging is that you cannot allow a unilateral world anymore. And therefore, BRICS is an attempt to have a multilateral kind of world vision where a large number of countries, now you look at BRICS, they represent bulk of the population of the world. Their economy is, if you combine the people who are members, is training to compete with what is EU.
I think it's 37% of the world's
right,
GDP.
37%. And there is a long list of countries that is beginning to want to join BRICS, because I think they find that their interests are better protected being part of BRICS than, and let me say, the EU has lost its appeal to most countries. America, whether you like it or not, you have to learn that that's the most, you have to live with the thought that's the most powerful country. But people are beginning to challenge unilateralism. And I think we will see, I don't see there will be a, let's say, sudden challenge from the BRICS, but slowly the weight of BRICS as far as economy is concerned, slowly the weight of BRICS as far as world institutions is concerned, is going to make its presence felt. And I think we are looking at a world which is multilateral, no longer unilateral.
Yes, but what we're also seeing is a resistance to the idea that on the American side, that unilateral role should be challenged, because you can see it in the discourse of Tony Blinken. That's when he talks about the rules-based order. It's a rules-based order where the rule book has been written and been applied for the last 40 years by the US.
So what people in the global south are beginning to say is, who's written the rules? We want fair rules that are not just in the interest of ABC, but in our interest as well. And I think this is going to take shape, but may not be immediate, but slowly. You look at the sanctions. An alternate economy has prospered, and Russia is beginning to do, because there is demand and supply question. Europe needs Russian oil, Russian gas. All that they are beginning to do is to not get it directly, but indirectly, and pay much more for it. So that's the reality. We have to get to, you take the case of India. A lot of people, and I think our foreign minister had explained it very brilliantly, to say that India is a net importer of petroleum products. And we have to look at our interests. If despite sanctions, Europe is beginning to continue to import Russian oil products in an indirect way, how can Russia forego, how can India not take the opportunity to get this product at a cheaper rate? That's what we have been doing. So I think nations will continue to challenge. The American unilateralism is not going to vanish, but will get diminished as we move into the future. China is a dark horse. There is and India and China have the largest trade, yet we have a conflict that is simmering in Ladakh. So, but it's been capped, and I hope the two countries are able to, we will be able to resolve it, because we realize you can't have two of the world's most populous countries fighting each other.
No, that I think there are enough reasonable people on both sides to say that, and people who take into account their knowledge of history, which is what I'm complaining about with the US, is if Americans would just listen to their own historians,
right,
they might be able to do things in a more rational way, and ones that do not lead to what we now accept as a fact of nature, that there are forever wars. The idea of having the adjective forever before a war, nobody would have ever thought of that. But for the last 30 years, that's what we've been looking at, is a system of forever wars, which means permanent conflict, which means that you're focusing on the areas where conflict can exist, as between India and China. You could say everything's about the border. Or you're talking about the kind of economic and political, geopolitical cooperation that can make that can defend the interests of both countries without
win-win situation. Right, absolute win-win situation.
So, so my question about BRICS is we're watching it evolve in ways that people are not that people don't see as dramatically influencing the events in the world. But we've talked about the military dimension of the unipolar world, but there's also the economic, the financial side, and that is the role of the dollar, which is where BRICS is really making inroads, because the dollar is not being challenged directly, but indirectly, and being removed slowly as the bloodline of the global economy.
Right, absolutely. I think the next decade or so would be crucial for how the world evolves in the future. Let me just give you a thought. I think the world bodies need restructuring. It's clear to everyone. You look at the United Nations Security Council, the P5. Can you imagine the country with the largest population in the world, a rising economy, all good institutions, is not a member, whereas we are having legacy members based on World War II?
Yes. No, I mean, it's a scandalous idea when you think about it. But again, people consider this to be the normal state of things, the status quo. The idea, I think, in a lot of people's minds is that the American system worked for 50 years or 70 years, whatever, however you want to count it. So why should we be challenging it? Why should we even think that it's time to readjust things, readjust the rules of the game?
Because Peter, the world is not the same. When the system was designed, it has changed. Look at where China was. Look at where India was. Look at where Brazil was. Look at where South Africa was. And today, these countries are rising economically. India and China also are militarily strong. So there is, you can't have proxy members of the UN Security Council who just ditto what one part says. And I think sooner than later, this will have to be restructured. And
but you can see there's a real resistance because people are saying
there is resistance, but one to one, every country, including US, Russia, UK, France, Germany, everybody acknowledges that India must have a seat on the high table. Yet they create conditions where you can't move forward. So extra claimants come in. Somebody from Africa wants to come. Somebody from South America wants to come. So the situation is created where the move forward is timing. But I think you can't stop a country like India, the largest population, a rising economic power, has all other attributes, including a peaceful nuclear capability.
Yes.
India has an open doctrine on this. And therefore, I think a lot of countries are beginning, at least in the global south, are beginning to look towards India as somebody who will, if not be their leader, will at least show the way forward in a mutually beneficial way.
Yes, I think anyone who just sits down and tries to seriously analyze it will come to exactly the same conclusion. The problem is that today the power lies with the current Security Council, which has an entire right over everything to the extent that its members have a veto. And so they can veto anything that...
But the question is, has the Security Council come with a solution for any protracted problem? No.
Because... No, but that's where I say rational people agree on this.
Yes.
But there's an irrational friend. My real question is, does it require some kind of really dramatic, catastrophic thing, more intense than just a border war?
Yeah, I think, Peter, the Ukraine war is just too far out into Europe to effect. And I think it is between two nuclear powers, one a proxy and the other actually fighting.
Yeah.
But I think a situation is developing in the Middle East with Israel, the
Yes.
Palestinians, Iran,
And Iran.
yeah, Iraq, Saudi Arabia, UAE. And so far, we haven't crossed the Rubicon, but you don't know how things, one particular incident can engulf the whole region. And if Middle East explodes, the world will be affected. And
Yeah.
I think that's at present the catastrophic possibility one could look at. I hope it doesn't happen and better sense prevails on
Yeah.
all sides.
I think we'll close on that note, I think, of optimism. It seems to me that something dramatic has to happen, but it doesn't have to be catastrophic. You evoked the possibility at the very beginning of our conversation of nuclear war, World War III, and we see that I suppose you would agree that we've never been closer. I mean, I lived through the Cuban Missile Crisis. I was in high school at the time, and that was a very frightening experience for us Americans. We could see the mushroom clouds exploding in our own neighborhoods, in our minds. It was reality. What's surprising today is that people are not. They don't have that imagination to see that
Absolutely.
they are on the brink of doing.
It doesn't invoke the same concerns in the new generation, which actually is also in part. In fact, to that extent, one leader who gets admired for his straight talk is the Hungarian Prime Minister.
Absolutely, Orban.
Uh, he has earned a lot of admirers, at
Yeah.
least in India, with his straight, blunt talk of what we could get into. And I'm surprised some of the very small countries like the Baltic states, the East Europeans, some in Europe, smaller countries, even two big countries, France and Germany, talk of this in a slightly light-hearted manner.
Yeah.
You know, the seriousness of, because there is a line which should never be approached, leave alone crossed. If you cross that line once, then events go out of control. And there are enough sane people in the world who are cautioning on this. And I hope deep down, most people in authority are also aware. I hope so.
Yeah, well, the danger seems to be more acute in the Middle East, where you have someone like Netanyahu, who's even less reasonable than
Right.
Zelensky, and whose culture, their military culture, seems to me far more dangerous than anything else we've seen. You talked about earlier that both Russia and the US have shown considerable restraint,
Right.
even while pursuing the conflict. But there are some people who may not feel restrained. And I don't know if you'd agree that there's a parallel between the Middle East situation and Ukraine insofar as you have two leaders, Netanyahu and Zelensky, who are trying to get the US
involved. Absolutely.
And that brings us to a real brink if that takes place.
Absolutely.
So at what point do they become desperate? at what point does their decision making include the idea, well, it's all or nothing. Let's go.
Let me, before we finish, Peter, can I ask you a question?
Yeah.
Because you have a pole position to look at this whole thing. How does Mr. Putin's actions come out? A lot of people think that he has been quite restrained. He has been quite balanced in his approach, has not reacted to various provocations that keep going periodically, assassinations, bombings, other things. And I think that's one of the reasons that we haven't crossed a particular line. What is your?
Well, that's totally my view. And I'm aware that there are people in the Russian hierarchy who are saying, well, it's about time to get the job done. We know that we're winning. Let's just show them that we can do it. And that is a red line. That will be seen as a red line for the Americans. So who crosses it first? I don't know. But my impression is that Putin has been very restrained. Now, if you read the Western press, they say the only reason Putin has been restrained is he's frightened. We have intimidated him. With our power, with our capability, he doesn't dare to do anything. So we need to continue the battle. And I think that's just totally wrong. But if you look at any of the mainstream people in the news, the way they describe it is that's the way Kamala Harris described it in the debate, saying it was thanks to our action that Putin did not conquer Ukraine and is not going to conquer Europe.
I don't think they have any designs on Europe.
No, there's absolutely no evidence of it. There's nothing you can cite materially that shows that there's any ambition to conquer, even to conquer Ukraine. And as you said, the Istanbul, well, in December 2021, Putin put forward a security framework that they could agree on to avoid war. So if you talk, but nobody talks about security, about security on both sides. So anyway, well, this has been a really interesting discussion, and I've learned quite a lot thanks to your military insight, which I have none of. It was great talking to you, and I hope we can.
My pleasure.
Join the conversation at Fair Observer and subscribe to our YouTube channel.